Hi, everybody. I'm KHOU 11 meteorologist Pat Kavlin.
And I'm meteorologist Tim Pandagis.
We're coming to you from Houston, Texas. It is time for the Wednesday midday update on Hurricane Ian as it makes its approach to Southwest Florida for Wednesday, September 28th, 2022. Let's get right to satellite.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with this, Pat. Overnight, it started as a 120 mile per hour Category 3 storm, and then it jumped to a major Category 4, 155 miles per hour. So it's right on the threshold of becoming a Category 5. You need 2 more miles per hour to get to 157. And it certainly is an angry looking satellite imagery there.
Yeah, and we're splitting hairs at this point. I mean, being so close to that Category 5 threshold, it would be more of bookkeeping for the National Hurricane Center if they upped it to 160. I mean, if we saw a big jump, obviously that's different. But between 155 mile per hour sustained winds and 160 mile per hour sustained winds, we're still looking at a devastating, life-changing storm for Southwest Florida.
Right, and we're just hours from landfall in Southwest Florida, and the thing to take away from this image here is there's no weakening evident at all. In fact, probably a little more strengthening before it actually moves over land and is away from its fuel source, which is the extremely warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico at this time.
Yeah, super symmetric eye wall structure here. You can see all of the gray and the white. That indicates the most intense thunderstorm development, kind of insulating that eye wall. And then you can see the eye itself looks pretty symmetric. A few wobbles here and there, and we're going to dive into that in just a second. But overall, this is a really mean looking storm. The eye wall currently scraping along the Lee County islands. So Sanibel Island, Captiva Island, they are taking it on the chin right now. We are likely to see this storm continue to move towards the north and east up towards Charlotte County.
And notable with this too, this storm is continuing to intensify while shear is really starting to be building on, and we've got 30 knot shear, and that's a moderate to even high level shear environment, which usually leads to a weakening of a storm. It starts to tilt it over. We're not seeing that in this case. When you get a storm as intense as Ian is right now, it usually is good at shielding itself from a lot of the effects of that shear.
Yeah, this storm has really done a good job of building itself up and insulating itself, and so we don't anticipate any weakening here within the next few hours. But this thing exploded overnight. Like you said, went from 120 mile per hour winds in the 2 a.m. advisory to 155 at 5:30 in the morning Central Time.
Right, and that's the second time it's satisfied the rapid intensification definition from the Hurricane Center.
And that definition is a 35 mile per hour wind jump in 24 hours. We did it in 3.5 hours this morning. So just remarkable statistics. This is definitely going to be a storm that scientists study in the years to come. Let's switch over to radar. We'll give you a better look of exactly what's going on. A lot to diagnose here.
Right, you can tell a lot from the radar imagery, and that's an essential tool in a situation like this. So you're looking at the eye there. It's rather large, about 25 nautical miles in diameter, according to the National Hurricane Center most recent update. Now, you're going to find the strongest of the winds in the eye wall here. You can see the really dark colors on the radar imagery. Very heavy rain there, too. And that eye wall is starting to build onshore, so the strongest of the winds over Sanibel Island, and eventually that'll pivot on to the north. So we're getting that onshore flow, Pat, and that's why the storm surge risk is so huge.
Yeah, the storm surge risk here is more pronounced than pretty much anywhere else in the United States during a landfalling hurricane. That just has a lot to do with the slope of the seabed. So the shoreline going underwater is pretty shallow for about 200 miles going into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a really shallow incline. And because of that, it just allows this water to pile up so easily. I mean, think about a ball, right? You roll a ball up a hill. If it's a shallow hill, that ball is going to go pretty far.
Yeah.
If you have a steep hill and you try to roll the ball up at the same energy, it's not going to go as far. Same principle here. We've got a shallow hill under the water, and that is allowing that water to very easily pile up on the heels of almost a Category 5 hurricane.
Right, and those of you along the Southwest Florida coastline have been dealing with conditions deteriorating for about the last 24 hours. And now that the eye wall is building onshore, you're getting the strongest winds. Now, landfall is not defined until the center of this eye actually moves over land. And we expect that to happen around the lunch hour. So it's still got a couple more hours over the open waters, still over its fuel source. So maybe a little burst of intensification right up to landfall that we could make it to that Category 5 status. Again, it won't make much of a difference in the impacts, but it may be historical here if we do get that Cat 5.
Yeah, so with that said, you got to have the center onshore like Tim just said. So even though the outer islands here of Lee County in Southwest Florida are getting scraped by the eye wall, that's not technically a landfall. I mean, the actual center, the middle point of the storm has to cross over land. So even if it's just a third of the eye, that's still not landfall. The whole thing has to cross over. That will likely happen as we get up towards Charlotte County later on during the day on Wednesday. Now, Tim, you wanted to talk about this because this is incredible.
So every now and then we have satellite imagery all the time, right? A GO-16 satellite that looks down, takes pictures of the cloud surface. Now, when there is a significant weather event, we have something called mesoscale floaters that are even more high resolution. So this is taking a picture of Ian from space every minute, and we get the high resolution imagery here. And here is the eye. And now as we play it out over the last 3 hours, you can see there's little spins within the actual eye. Those are called mesovortices. And a lot of times that is where you find the strongest of the winds. A lot of times even stronger than what the Hurricane Center is saying is in there right now. Sustained at 155, you can get gusts 170, 175 just in those mesovortices.
Yeah, and so this is going to cause obviously huge problems once it goes onshore because these mesovortices have been traveling around the eye wall for the last few hours. And again, with no sign of weakening, we don't anticipate any change as this comes onshore. Somewhere, we're thinking between Englewood and Cape Coral. That's what the landfall point is looking the most likely right now.
And as this makes landfall, it's going to be moving over populated areas, right? So it's daylight out there right now, and within the eye itself, winds drop off dramatically.
Yes.
In fact, you can even see the ocean surface down there. It clears out as well. So you get the strongest of the winds in the eye wall. Then you get into the core. Pressure is the lowest, but the skies are
Dead
clearing.
calm.
So that's what really throws people through a loop out there. If you're getting hit by the eye wall, the winds all of a sudden drop. And then you get the back end of the core to move on through, and you get whipped by the opposite direction winds.
That's the thing about hurricanes is that right now we're seeing, we'll go to the, do you want to talk more about the satellite? Because
No, I'm good.
The wind gusts here, I mean, they're pretty impressive right now. But you could tell we're not getting hurricane strength gusts yet. At least at this point. Still, 60 up towards Sarasota, Venice, 67 mile per hour gusts up towards Punta Gorda. What is interesting though, we are now missing the Fort Myers site. We're missing the Naples site. Not sure if that's a power related issue as power outages are starting to spread through the area or if they were knocked off site because of a high wind gust. But what's important to note, like Tim was saying, is that within that eye wall, the winds go calm very quickly. But before that happens, as the eye wall approaches, you're going to see these values go from 60 to 80 to 120 to 150 very fast. So conditions will deteriorate very quickly in the areas that are right in line for that direct landfall.
Right, and also take note on this graphic of the direction of which the winds are originating. So we're going to find the worst storm surge values to the right of the center of Ian, right? So it's all coming onshore there, and that's piling the ocean water up along those low-lying areas. Now, once this builds inland, we'll start to see the winds shift around and come back around for a second hit at some storm surge values there. And what's happening here up towards the Tampa Bay areas where the winds are coming offshore, it's actually emptying the water out of Tampa Bay.
And it's not just Tampa Bay. In fact, so we're forecasting, the National Hurricane Center is forecasting landfall around the Port Charlotte area. So that's Charlotte Harbor. That connects to the Peace River, which goes all the way up through DeSoto County. So the winds right now are going due east. So they're wrapping around the north side of the storm. So it's pulling all of the water from Charlotte Harbor out of the harbor and into the Gulf of Mexico. We actually have a live camera showing that. This is the Peace River. This is not a beach. And yet you can still see sand going. This is probably about 150 to 200 feet out from the shoreline. So this is remarkable. And what's happening here is that the winds are going in this direction. So this side of the screen is to the east, over here is to the west. So the Gulf of Mexico is back this way. When you have the winds pulling in that direction for an extended period of time, it actually lowers the water level in a body of water, even if it's a river, because upstream it can't fill fast enough. So you start to get these lowering water levels. There's actually marinas in Port Charlotte and Punta Gorda right now where boats are on the mud. They're sitting in the mud. They're not even in the water anymore.
And now, Pat, that probably gives people a false sense of security, right? Well, the water's going out, it's not going to come back in, but that's really the absolute opposite.
Well, and it depends on where that landfall is, right? So if the landfall is south of this spot, Punta Gorda, Port Charlotte may luck out. But in places like Fort Myers and as you get up towards Cape Coral, I mean, that water's going to keep piling on. But yeah, that false sense of security can be very dangerous. I mean, this is obviously the point of the day as the storm gets closer that you want to be inside. But really a remarkable shot here. We'll take you to another one. This is a little farther south now, a little harder to make it out. This is in Naples. You can see just blinding rainfall. We can still see, though, I mean, we still have the camera image, which is great. So the Gulf of Mexico is out here in the distance. So north would be on that side, south would be on my side of the camera. And there's not a lot to see here, but as we switch over to another Naples camera, different story. All of these homes here, so here's the barrier island on the outside. So the Gulf of Mexico is out in that direction. And we are already seeing, I know it's hard to see in this camera shot, but along these canals, water is now starting, I mean, it's totally over banks. And now starting to come into this home here. So we're seeing flooding already in some of these homes along this canal. And I know it's kind of hard to see with the water droplets on the camera lens, but as they clear out occasionally, you really get a sense. Notice the water's coming up here as well. So we're seeing that storm surge in an area that is protected by a barrier island, right? I mean, you've got this huge, it's blinding rain right now, but you got this huge barrier island out here. And the water from the Gulf is still coming around that through the inlets and flooding the canals.
And this is only the beginning.
This is only the beginning,
Long-lasting, a long-duration event.
But what a contrast, right? So on the north end of the storm, water is leaving the bays. And to the south of the storm, water is coming onshore because you have that onshore wind. So that's what we're talking about. Whereas the storm moves up the coast, you're going to see that wind shift. But this is bad news here.
Sure is. Yeah.
What else we have? Let's take a look at the forecast track. So over the next few days, we do expect this to weaken.
Yeah, as it moves over land, it's away from its fuel source at that point. So rapid weakening likely here as we get into as early as tomorrow morning, down to 70-mile-per-hour winds, over half the intensity that it's at landfall. And then by the time it moves back over north of Cape Canaveral, it's back over the open, warm water. So it may try to reorganize again and possibly make a secondary landfall as a higher-end tropical storm by Friday morning. So we could be looking at numerous areas getting impacts here. Of course, if it does make an impact or a landfall there, the impacts will be much less severe than what we're going to be dealing with or what we currently are dealing with near Fort Myers.
But definitely going to be a big rainmaker for these spots, especially as that moisture interacts with the Appalachians, gets squeezed out. I mean, we could be talking about flooding potentials through the Carolinas, through Georgia, and also a very unusual spot to see a tropical landfall.
It's been some time since Charleston and the Savannah area have seen a tropical storm making landfall in their neck of the woods. Usually when they come up, they're looping on out and they're going to hit the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They don't make it as far off to the west in that part of the country. So
that's the official track from the National Hurricane Center. Let's switch over to one of our forecast models. And just to reiterate, I mean, this is unbelievable. You know, just to reiterate, though, what we were talking about with the wind streams. Remember, on the north end of the storm, winds are going east to west. See if I can switch over to an easier color to see. We'll go blue. See if that's any easier. There we go. Winds are east to west on the north end of the storm, and then on the south end, they're coming in off the Gulf. So that's why up in Port Charlotte, the water is leaving the harbor, and down in Naples, even areas that are protected by the barrier island, that water is getting pushed onshore. So that's why when we're talking storm surge, the exact point of landfall for the hurricane, which is very hard to predict up until about 12 hours out, and even then it's kind of tough, is so critical because, especially in a situation like this where the whole coastline is so vulnerable, but it does look like landfall will be somewhere here around Charlotte Harbor down towards Cape Coral, which, by the way, is the largest city in Southwest Florida.
Right, and it's also, I want to point out with this image here, is that you saw 155-mile-per-hour winds with this. You're likely to see that, if you in fact do see that at the surface, right around the core here. So you see this bright band throughout the center there, the eye wall. That's where you'll find the strongest of the winds. But notice there are periods here that are lighter green. So the wind is not constant. You're going to have ramp ups and ramp downs in terms of the strongest winds. The strongest winds are on the outermost bands and the strongest thunderstorms here. And then it continues to band out and ramp down as you get farther away from that storm center. And that's impacting a large part of Southwest Florida.
Huge. And I mean, look at what happened yesterday. We had tornado reports, 15 storm reports yesterday across the east coast of Florida. That's 150 miles away from the center of where the storm was. For our Texas viewers, that's a straight line distance between here and Waco. So this storm is huge and much, much bigger than Charlie, which made landfall
no comparison.
No comparison at all. That made landfall up in the Port Charlotte area back in 2004. Similar intensity, but 2.5 times smaller than this storm. So a larger storm means more impacts for more people. So let's play this out. Let's see what happens here. notice how lopsided it becomes.
Right, it's interacting with an incoming boundary off to the northwest, and that's going to help to shear it out. Right now, it's actually helping to ventilate it, which is why it's getting so strong.
Yes.
But once it moves over land, it's going to become really drawn out and stretched, and all of that moisture will spread into central and north Florida, raining out like 1 to 2 feet of tropical moisture.
That's the thing here is notice it's not going to be a prolific rainmaker for Southwest Florida. The big threat for Southwest Florida is going to be storm surge. The big threat from Tampa up to Orlando along the I-4 corridor and then points north towards St. Augustine and Jacksonville is going to be the potential for prolific flooding, 1 to 2 feet with locally higher amounts.
Yeah, freshwater flooding is going to be a big problem, especially since this area is so saturated right now too.
And another part that we want to point out, and Tim, this is something that you had touched on before, the storm surge threat isn't over as we get into Wednesday night. Because on the back end of the storm, remember, we've still got those strong winds funneling in off the Gulf of Mexico because that's the flow around these storms, right? It's counterclockwise. Well, that's going to draw in wind from the Gulf of Mexico, and that means more storm surge potential until this thing is totally off the Atlantic coast.
Well, to that same point too, Pat, at that point in time on the east coast of Florida, we're going to have that onshore flow as well, north of Melbourne and Cape Canaveral. So storm surge on the east coast of Florida is not completely outside of the realm of possibility too, even though we're going to have a weakening tropical cyclone at that point. Once it moves offshore, it'll start to deepen again, and we'll see the winds. Jacksonville area could see storm surge values a couple feet.
Yeah, which means water inundation over ground level, so on top of what's typically there. So we could see some flooding potential all the way up towards the northeast coast of Florida. From there, as Tim mentioned, the storm potentially recurves, and you can see there's a little bit of difference here between our computer model, which takes it up in that area, versus the official forecast of the National Hurricane Center, which is more towards the Savannah area, maybe up towards Hilton Head Island. Bottom line, though, Georgia, South Carolina coastline need to be watching this carefully, because even if that landfall point is towards Savannah, you're talking about, again, big onshore flow through South Carolina, torrential rainfall, so flooding, storm surge, a big concern.
And a lot of that moisture will be butting up against the spine of the Appalachians, which will lead to some flooding in interior portions of the eastern part of the United States as well. Look at these rainfall totals. I mean, this is unreal because it's all on the northwest side of the storm track, which is butting up against that trough, so that's squeezing out the atmosphere, wringing it out like a sponge, 1 to 2 feet potentially in some of these areas.
And typically we say it's the east side of the storm relative to the forward motion, the right side of the storm, that you get the worst impacts, rain, wind, flooding. With this, it's going to be the north and the west side in terms of rainfall. Storm surge and wind is still going to be an issue, especially on the east side. But the rainfall is just prolific here. Again, from the Tampa area along I-4 towards Orlando, 10 to 20 inches of rain possibly. And then up towards the Jacksonville area. I mean, big time rain potential. And look at how fast it drops off. That green shading there for South Florida up towards Southwest Florida, 1 to 3 inches. A lot of rain, but not unmanageable.
Right, and that's because you had mentioned yesterday is how the dry air is actually going to get pulled into the storm, and that'll lead to a big drop-off or a big gradient in those big totals.
And typically we don't have dry air over the Gulf of Mexico, but we just had a cold front that is sitting right over the Gulf, and that helped to pull in some dry air, and as that storm pulls away, it's going to take all that dry air with it, and it's going to zap all those rain totals on the east side of the storm.
Right.
Think about that for a sec, but definitely not a good story. So look, even though Tampa is out of the cone, the storm surge threat's lower. The storm is not over for you yet. We're talking about the chance for some really big time flooding up in the Tampa Bay area.
And how many times do we say, too, the threats or the impacts are well
Huge.
outside of the cone? It's not just inside the cone that you see those impacts.
And I
at
think
all.
yesterday proved that with the tornadoes
Absolutely.
in South Florida.
Storm surge, Pat, this is the biggest problem, as you said, for Southwest Florida, and then the freshwater flooding to the north from there.
Yeah, so obviously this is a pretty wide range of areas that are under the storm surge warning, but really what we want to focus on is Southwest Florida from Port Charlotte all the way down towards the Naples area, and that's the area that the National Hurricane Center has really highlighted here for the potential to see some life-changing flooding.
I mean, the possibility of 2-story buildings being inundated by ocean water, and then you have wave action on top of that, is really worrisome here. Again, this is worst case scenario, 18 feet, but it's a possibility with the current intensity and the forecast track of Ian going forward. I do also want to note that these totals are going to be spread out over time. It's not just an instantaneous event, storm surge. It builds up and then peaks, and that peak looks to coincide, Pat, with astronomical high tides later on today as well.
Yeah, high tide around Fort Myers this evening, I believe, is around 5:30 local time. That's around the time we're expecting the onshore winds to really ramp up up there. So
Yeah.
the timing is terrible with this. Can our director hot punch up? We have a camera, I think, still from Naples. Is that still available? The Naples Pier camera? It's going out? Okay, it looks like we don't have it at the moment, but that was a pretty remarkable shot because the water had totally covered up the sand and was then starting to kind of crash along the vegetation, protecting the homes.
Yeah, we'll look at those peak storm surge values likely coming in later on this afternoon. So building for about the next 6 hours or so.
Yeah, so that's what we have for you. A lot going on today. We're going to be tracking the latest here. Follow along this YouTube channel for more updates. Tim will have you covered here as we go through the evening. We've got David Paul, we've got Kim Castro, and our own Cheetah Craft. She was actually flying with the hurricane hunters today.
She'll likely be flying through the center of Ian right when it makes landfall later on this afternoon. So the video she'll have will be epic.
Unbelievable.
Yep.
Yeah, but a very dangerous storm here. Keep the folks in Southwest Florida in your thoughts because this is going to be a life-changing storm for those folks. Thanks for watching. We're going to keep doing these updates here over the next few days.